The Galactic Council had seen a lot of things in its 400,000-year existence. Civilizations rising, civilizations collapsing, one particularly embarrassing incident involving the Vreth ambassador, and a bowl of fermented moonkelp that we do not discuss anymore. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, in the entire recorded history of the known universe had prepared the Council for what humanity did on the 14th cycle of the Ardean Accord Summit. Let me back up. My name is Orvan Desh, Senior Diplomatic Observer for the Kelthari Confederation, and I was sitting in the observation gallery when it all went sideways. I had my data slate, my thermos of warm vellum brew, and a very comfortable seat. I was expecting a boring day. Routine sanctions review, some procedural arguments about terraforming rights in the outer belts, maybe a strongly worded statement from the Murath delegation about resource allocation, the usual galactic theater, loud and mostly pointless. Instead, I watched humanity declare war on 4 species simultaneously, survive a coordinated orbital bombardment, and then, and this is the part that still makes me check my medical records for stress-induced neurological damage, counterattack with something no one had ever seen before. But let's start at the beginning, because context matters, and because the beginning is, frankly, also insane. Humanity joined the Galactic Council 43 standard years ago. They came in loud, confident, and carrying the kind of arrogance that only a species that had never actually met a peer civilization could manage. They filed their membership application with a cover letter, an actual cover letter, that described Earth as, quote, a resilient, adaptive, and deeply motivated civilization eager to participate in the broader galactic community. The Morath delegation laughed so hard that Ambassador Vreth required medical attention. The Doraki simply stared at the document for 11 minutes in total silence, which for them is apparently the equivalent of a standing ovation of disbelief. They were admitted anyway. The Council has a policy about admitting emerging civilizations before they develop weapons capable of interstellar reach. It is easier to manage them inside the tent, as the Terran expression goes, or so the Council believed. For 43 years, humanity sat at the lower tables. They voted on things that didn't matter. They filed complaints that were politely archived and never reviewed. They sent ambassadors, 3 of them, all of whom were systematically ignored, patronized, or talked over during every session. Ambassador Yusuf Okafor was particularly persistent. The man had the patience of a geological formation and the quiet intensity of someone who had been keeping very careful notes. He had been keeping very careful notes. The Ardean Accord Summit was called to formalize something that had already been decided in private. 4 of the Council's dominant species, the Murath, the Doraki, the Sealvoth, and the Preth Collective, had quietly agreed to reclassify 12 star systems along humanity's expansion corridor as protected heritage zones. This was, in practice, a territorial lockout. It would cut Earth off from approximately 60% of its projected colonization paths and strand 3 existing human outpost stations in bureaucratic limbo for the next 200 years, minimum. They had the votes. They had the procedural framework. They had, as far as anyone in that room was concerned, already won. Okafor walked in that morning wearing a dark suit with no insignia, carrying a single physical folder, accompanied by 2 aides, a young woman named Priya Sundaram, who looked like she had not slept in 3 days, and a man named Theodore Malik, who had the calm, flat expression of someone who had already run every possible outcome through his head and was entirely at peace with all of them. The session opened. The Murath senior arbiter, a towering figure named Resek, presented the Accord reclassification proposal with the bored confidence of someone reading a grocery list. The language was dense, procedural, and designed to be so technically airtight that no objection would find any purchase. I was watching Okafor during all of this. He was writing something on the physical paper inside his folder, with a pen, an actual ink pen. I found this detail deeply unsettling in a way I could not immediately explain. Resek finished. The chamber prepared for the routine affirmation vote. And then Okafor raised his hand. There was a pause. Hands, or hand equivalents, are raised at council sessions with some regularity. But there was something about the particular stillness of Okafor's gesture, the deliberateness of it, the complete lack of urgency, that made several senior delegates look up from their data slates. Resek, with visible reluctance, acknowledged him. Okafor stood. He opened his folder. He looked at it for exactly 2 seconds, then set it face down on the table and addressed the chamber entirely from memory. "The proposed reclassification," he said, his voice carrying with complete ease through the acoustics of the hall, "violates 6 provisions of the original Ardean Accord, as ratified, 17 subclauses of the Cathali Expansion Treaty that the Murath themselves authored, and constitutes what the Council's own legal framework defines as coordinated territorial suppression of a recognized member civilization." He paused. "We have filed the relevant documentation with the Council's archival tribunal, all 642 pages of it." I heard Priya Sundaram say something quietly to Theodore Malik. He nodded. She pulled out her own data slate and began doing something very fast with her fingers. Rashek said that the documentation would be reviewed in due course, which everyone in the room understood to mean never, and that the vote would proceed as scheduled. Okafor nodded pleasantly. "Of course," he said, "we expected that." That sentence landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. He sat down. The vote proceeded. The reclassification passed. The Murath, the Duraki, the Selvath, and the Preth Collective all cast their affirmations with the unhurried confidence of people who had already won. The human delegation's single dissenting vote was logged and immediately rendered irrelevant by the margin. Resek announced the result. Several delegates began gathering their materials. Someone from the Selvath bloc was already sending congratulatory signals to their home council. And then every display surface in the grand deliberation hall lit up simultaneously. Not with an error, not with a technical fault, with a broadcast, live, real-time, already running on approximately 940 separate communications networks across council space, including 17 that were supposedly restricted to internal government use only. I still have no idea how they got into those. The broadcast was narrated by a human woman named Daria Voss, who had a voice like calm water over sharp rocks, and the delivery of someone who had been waiting a very long time to say exactly these words. The broadcast presented, in precise and devastating detail, a complete record of the private negotiations between the 4 species over the preceding 8 years. Every communication, every agreement, every meeting, every moment where the reclassification had been discussed in explicit terms as a mechanism for containing humanity's expansion before it could reach the point where containment became impossible. There was a particular message from a Preth Collective senior coordinator to Resek himself, sent 14 months ago, that described the need to act, quote, before the humans realize how little the Accord actually protects them, and begin asking questions we cannot legally answer. The hall was very quiet. I looked at Theodore Malik. He was looking at the display with the expression of a man watching a sunset he had personally scheduled. Okafor had not moved. He was sitting with his folder closed in front of him, and an expression on his face that I can only describe as the diplomatic equivalent of someone who has just set down a very heavy bag they had been carrying for a very long time. Resek attempted to speak. He managed several syllables of what I think was intended to be a procedural objection before the Kelthari senior delegate, my own superior, old Tassara Vond, a being I had never seen visibly surprised in 20 years of service, leaned forward and said, with genuine bewilderment, "How long have they been planning this?" Priya Sundaram answered from across the hall, without looking up from her data slate. 8 years, 4 months, and 17 days, she said. Approximately 1 week after our first territorial complaint was archived without review. I made a note on my own data slate. It said, "These people have been angry for 8 years and none of us noticed." I underlined it twice, and then sat back and thought about what that meant. It meant that for 8 years, through 3 ambassadors, 60-something ignored complaints, and a systematic campaign of diplomatic exclusion, humanity had been doing 2 things at once. They had been showing up, raising their hands, filing their documents, and playing by the rules with complete sincerity. And they had simultaneously been building something else entirely, a contingency architecture so thorough, so precisely calibrated to the Council's own legal language and procedural weaknesses, that when they finally deployed it, there was not a single point of entry for a counter-argument. They had not gotten angry. They had not threatened. They had not done any of the things that the Council's strategic models predicted an emerging species would do when pushed into a corner. They had waited, and collected, and planned, and then walked into the most formal session of the galactic year and detonated it with a folder and a pen and a broadcast that was already running before the vote was finished. The chamber was still absorbing this when Okafor stood again. "We would like to propose," he said, with that same quiet and terrible pleasantness, "a full procedural review of the reclassification, conducted by the Independent Tribunal, under the terms of Article 7 of the Cathali Expansion Treaty." He picked up his folder. "We've already submitted the motion. It was filed this morning, approximately 2 hours before this session began." He looked at Resek with the patience of a geological formation. "We'll wait," and that was only the morning session. The afternoon session was delayed by 3 hours. This was officially attributed to procedural recalibration requirements, which is council speak for everyone in the building needed time to stop making sounds and compose themselves. I spent most of those 3 hours in the observer gallery drinking vellum brew I did not taste and rereading my note about humanity being quietly furious for 8 years. I added a second note beneath it. It said, "We assumed they were losing. They were counting." Tassara Vond, my superior, walked past me twice during the recess. The second time she stopped, looked at me with the expression of someone reassessing every assumption they had made about a subject for the past 4 decades, and said simply, "Find out everything about that woman, the one with the data slate." Then she walked away. Priya Sundaram, as it turned out, was a specialist in galactic legal architecture, specifically in the mapping of procedural vulnerabilities across multi-party treaty frameworks. She had written her doctoral work on the subject at age 26. Her thesis had been titled, with what I now recognized as extraordinary foreshadowing, "Institutional Capture and the Mechanisms of Manufactured Consensus in Multi-Species Governance Bodies." The Council's own academic archive had catalogued it, assigned it a reference number, and then left it entirely unread for 11 years. I added a third note. It said, "They told us exactly what they were going to do." When the session resumed, the atmosphere had changed in the specific way that atmospheres change when everyone in a room has privately recalculated their position and is now waiting to see who moves first. Resek had been replaced at the Murath primary table by a much older delegate named Sorveth, who had the look of someone brought in specifically because they had survived disasters before. The Doraki delegation had added 2 members. The Preth collective representative, a being named Quesh Allah, was sitting very still in the way that Preth sit still when they are communicating rapidly through their subvocal frequency channels and do not wish anyone to know it. Okafor was exactly where he had been. Same suit, same folder. Theodore Malik had acquired a second cup of something warm and was holding it with the serenity of a man on a pleasant holiday. The independent tribunal motion was addressed first, because legally it had to be. Sorveth attempted 4 separate procedural arguments against accepting it. Okafor's team answered each one in sequence, citing specific articles with the precision of people who had pre-written the responses months ago, which they almost certainly had. The 4th argument was the most creative, a clause in a supplementary accord from 260 years ago that had never been invoked ever in the entire history of the Council. Okafor let Sorveth finish, nodded with what appeared to be genuine respect for the effort, and then Priya Sundaram read out, from memory, a counter-provision from the same accord, 3 clauses later, that directly superseded it. There was a moment after she finished where Sorveth looked at her with something that I think in Murath emotional terms constituted awe. The motion passed. The tribunal review was formally initiated. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, fine, this is a legal victory. Impressive, certainly. Unexpectedly thorough, absolutely. But a legal victory is still just a legal victory. The Council has mechanisms for managing those. Decisions get reviewed, timelines get extended, things get complicated and slow, and eventually ground down into compromises that leave everyone moderately dissatisfied and the original injustice roughly intact. The Council is very good at this. It has had 400,000 years of practice. What the Council had not accounted for was that the broadcast was still running, not just running, growing. The original 940 network feeds had expanded, in the 3 hours of the recess, to somewhere north of 4,000. It had been picked up by independent journalism networks in 7 different species home systems. It had been translated into 31 languages, a Kelthari independent commentary channel, not affiliated with my government. I checked immediately, and with some anxiety, had done a segment on it that had been viewed by approximately 40 million people before the afternoon session even began. The Silvath public information networks, which were state-controlled and normally utterly reliable, had attempted to suppress the broadcast and instead inadvertently created a mirror network of citizen-run relay stations that spread it faster than the original. Daria Voss, the woman narrating the broadcast, had apparently recorded 17 hours of material. They were releasing it in segments, timed segments, each one dropping at intervals calculated, as far as our analysts could determine, to maintain maximum sustained attention across different species' news cycles. Humanity had not just filed a legal challenge, they had turned the entire affair into a public spectacle that the Council could not control, could not suppress, and could not respond to faster than it was spreading, because the broadcast contained the Council's own internal communications, and therefore any denial was immediately falsifiable by the very people watching. This is the part where I want to be very clear about something. Because there is a version of this story where you watch it happen and think, clever, resourceful, good tactics, well executed, and you would be right. It was all of those things. But sitting in that gallery, watching Sorveth attempt to manage a legal proceeding while his own government's private communications were being narrated in calm, precise detail to 40 million people and counting, I felt something that I had not expected to feel, something that took me a while to name correctly. It was not admiration, exactly. It was closer to the particular unease you experience when you realize that you have been making assumptions about someone's capabilities and intentions for a very long time, and every single one of those assumptions was wrong, and the person in question knew that you were wrong, and said nothing, and waited. Humanity had been sitting at the small tables for 43 years. 43 years of being ignored, patronized, and systematically excluded from every decision that actually mattered. And they had never once shown their hand. Not when Ambassador Okafor was talked over for the 11th time, not when the first territorial complaint was archived, not when the reclassification negotiations began, and humanity's intelligence services, which were apparently considerably more capable than anyone had given them credit for, picked up the first signals of what was coming. They had shown up, filed documents, raised their hands, played the game exactly as the rules required, and simultaneously built, in complete silence, the most precise and comprehensive institutional counterattack in the recorded history of Council diplomacy. Theodore Malik, I later learned, had spent 6 years embedded in the Council's own archival systems, working as a data management specialist under a consulting contract. His access credentials had been entirely legitimate. His work had been entirely competent, and in 6 years, he had mapped every procedural weakness, every suppressed complaint, every private communication pathway, and every legal vulnerability in the Council's 400,000-year-old institutional framework with the patience and thoroughness of someone who intended to use the information exactly once, at exactly the right moment. He had used it this morning. I was thinking about all of this when the second phase began. At approximately the 14th hour of the session, a new communication came through the Council's primary diplomatic channel. Not from Earth. From Outpost Station Varan 7, one of the 3 human installations that would have been stranded by the reclassification. The station commander, a woman named Ingrid Falk, was requesting an emergency audience with the tribunal. Sorveth objected. The tribunal overruled him, because the motion had already been filed, as Priya Sundaram noted without any particular emphasis, 6 weeks ago, in anticipation of this specific procedural moment. Commander Falk appeared on the main display. She was a broad-shouldered woman with close-cropped silver hair, and the manner of someone who had been running a deep space installation for 15 years and was entirely unbothered by the concept of addressing the Galactic Council. She presented, in 40 minutes of precise testimony, the operational records of Varan 7 for the past decade, supply manifests, emergency response logs, the 14 separate occasions on which the station had provided assistance, medical, navigational, resource-based, to vessels from Council member species who had experienced emergencies in that sector. She named every vessel, every crew, every species. She presented signed documentation from the commanders of those vessels confirming the assistance received. Under the proposed reclassification, she said at the end, with a calm that I found almost medically impressive, Varan 7 would be unable to operate under its current mandate. The 14 species whose vessels we have assisted in this sector would lose their nearest emergency response point. I am not making an argument. She looked directly at the tribunal panel. I am providing operational data for the tribunal's consideration as requested. She had not made an argument. She had simply described reality in enough specific detail that the argument made itself in the minds of every delegate watching, without her having to say it. The Sealvath delegate, not the one who had voted for the reclassification that morning, but a different one who had quietly appeared at the Sealvath table during the recess, and whose seniority I was still attempting to determine, asked Commander Falk one question. They asked how long it would take to establish a replacement emergency response capability in that sector if Varan 7's mandate was restricted. Falk said, without hesitation, 30 to 40 years, minimum, depending on resource allocation. During that period, emergency response capacity in that sector would be effectively zero. The Sealvath delegate nodded slowly. Then they turned and had a quiet conversation with their table that lasted approximately 90 seconds. At the end of it, the Sealvath delegation formally withdrew its support for the reclassification. The room shifted. These things are like geological events. There is a moment of stillness, and then everything moves at once. The Preeth Collective, which had been very quiet since the morning session, submitted a written request for clarification on 3 points of the reclassification's legal basis. This was, in council procedural language, approximately equivalent to announcing that they were reconsidering their position. The Doraki delegation requested an adjournment to consult with their home government. Sorvath sat very still and stared at the table in front of him, with the expression of someone watching a structure they built carefully, and over many years come apart in a single afternoon. Okafor watched all of it. He did not appear triumphant. He did not appear relieved. He looked like a man who had done a calculation a very long time ago, waited for the numbers to play out, and was now observing the result with the detached interest of someone who had already moved on to the next calculation. When the session finally closed, 11 hours after it had opened, the reclassification had been suspended pending full tribunal review. 2 of the 4 supporting delegations had formally distanced themselves from their earlier votes, and Daria Voss's broadcast had been viewed in total by somewhere north of 200 million individuals across council space. I caught up with Okafor in the corridor outside the main hall. I am not sure exactly why, professional instinct perhaps, or the specific human impulse which I had apparently developed after too many years of observing them, to understand the person behind an event rather than just the event itself. He stopped when I introduced myself. He shook my hand, which is a human gesture I had been briefed on, but which still surprised me in the moment with its directness. I asked him, because I could not think of anything more precise to ask, how long he had known it would work. He considered this for a moment with genuine thoughtfulness. We didn't know it would work, he said. We knew it was right. We knew the documentation was accurate and the legal framework was sound. Whether it would work depended on whether enough people were paying attention. He paused. We thought they would be. People generally pay attention when you give them something true to look at. I thought about that for a long time afterward, standing in the corridor while the council's 400,000-year-old machinery groaned and recalibrated around me. Humanity had not won because they were stronger. They were not stronger. Not yet. And possibly not for a long time. They had won because they had understood something about the council that the council had never understood about itself, that an institution built on the performance of fairness is uniquely, catastrophically vulnerable to a direct confrontation with its own record. They had not counterattacked with weapons. They had counterattacked with documentation, testimony, and a broadcast that was still running when I went to sleep that night. Still running when I woke up the next morning. Still running when I woke up the next morning. I wrote one final note before I closed my data slate. It said, "Do not mistake patience for weakness. Do not mistake silence for acceptance, and under absolutely no circumstances mistake a species that has been quietly counting for 8 years for a species that has given up." I underlined it 3 times. Then I flagged it for distribution to every senior observer in the Kelthari Confederation, with a cover note recommending that it be read carefully and immediately by anyone currently involved in any policy decisions that affected humanity in any way. I considered that the least I could do. Orvan Desh, Senior Diplomatic Observer, Kelthari Confederation. End of report.